Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Vaughn Lodge and the Robert E. Howard Show. It's the Robert E. Howard Show once again. And it's late. It's 6:30 already. I went to bed last night and I woke up and somehow time had sprung forward here in California. I think back home at Stately Vaughan Manor, Roger is up to time travel shenanigans again. He's using his time machine, messing things up as usual. It'll probably be a disaster when I get back. But since I'm here, I'm doing a Robert E. Howard show. And today we're talking about this, the best. It's the best of Robert E. Howard. Or is it? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. The best of Robert E. Howard. This is a 2-volume best of collection that came out from Del Rey Books back in 2007. It's so much best of that they needed 2 volumes. So we're going to talk about these books and answer the question, is this the best? Did it accomplish its mission? And what's in these books? So there have been a few best of volumes over the years. In fact, the first hardcover volume of Robert E. Howard was a best of from Arkham House. And the contents of that were chosen by August Derleth. That was Skullface and others. And I did a video on that. I've also did a video on all the best of volumes. And there was another best of volume that came out from Penguin Books in the UK in, I think, 2009, I think is when it came out. And it was a 1-volume paperback modern classic that only came out in the UK for some reason. And it was pretty good. I did a video on that, I think, back when I was doing the Sunday Penguin, which was years ago. But today we're going to talk about the best of Robert E. Howard from Del Rey in detail. We're going to really get into these books and find out if these are, in fact, the best. So these books, I have a great affection for these books, and I've gone back to them over and over again over the years. And I love them. I will admit that right away. I think they're just great. But they do have a fatal flaw. They have a fatal flaw, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But we're going to talk about the contents of the book. We're going to talk about the artists who do the illustrations for the book and how these stories were chosen. So the stories were chosen by Robert E. Howard scholar Rusty Burke. And if anybody should be able to pick out a best of volume, it's probably Rusty Burke. But he didn't just go by his own idea of what the best of Robert E. Howard was. He also surveyed some other Robert E. Howard fans and scholars, people who loved and really knew all about Robert E. Howard. He asked them, hey, what are the best? And with all the information he gathered and his own personal choices, he came up with what he thought were the best. And it ended up being 2 volumes because there's just too much of the best. It's just too much of the best. He felt he couldn't put all of the stories that he wanted to put into this in 1 volume. And so what you end up with is a huge best of volume. If you put these 2 books together, it's 900 pages of best of, plus introductions and other stuff. The illustrations are by Jim and Ruth Keegan. Now, not everybody loves the illustrations in this book. I will get an example of the illustrations. You know how it is when you look for illustrations, even if a book is packed with them. When you look for them, you can't find them. So the illustrations in this are done in a very distinct style, which they went for deliberately. They deliberately went for kind of the streamlined style of the poster art of the 1930s. And I think it really works. So it was a deliberate choice. And for the most part, I think the illustrations in this are pretty great. But like I said, not everybody loves them. But I think they're pretty awesome. And there's a lot of illustrations in these volumes. And so we're going to look at some of those. These were not the most successful of the Del Rey books. I remember when I went to Howard Days in 2010, Jim and Ruth Keegan were actually there, which was interesting. And I guess I took these books with me to Cross Plains, Texas. And I could have gone up to them and asked them to sign my books, but it didn't even occur to me. I didn't even think of it. Part of that is social awkwardness, I suppose. And part of it is pure stupidity. But it was fun to hear them talk about doing the illustrations for these volumes. And Rusty Burke was there himself at Robert E. Howard Days in 2010 in Cross Plains. And he mentioned that these books out of the Del Rey volumes were not selling as well as the others. I think there's a pretty clear reason for that. First of all, at the time, the Del Rey books were just wonderful for a Robert E. Howard fan, because finally we were getting all of these stories and authoritative texts published wonderfully in illustrated volumes. And Del Rey published all of the Conan stories, all of the Cull stories, all the Bran MacMorn, all of Solomon Kane. Also, they did a volume of horror stories that was just wonderful. It's a wonderful volume. They did the historical stories, and they also did Francis Xavier Gordon, the El Borak stories. So they published a lot, but they did not publish everything. But that series of books from Del Rey has proven to be enormously popular. They started being published in the early 2000s, and they're still in print. You can still get all those volumes today, and I highly recommend them. Unfortunately, like I said, they ceased publication, or they ceased publishing new volumes in the series in, I think, around 2010 with the historical volume, the volume of historical stories. And they haven't published any new volumes in the series since then. And there's a lot of stuff that they left unpublished. The Westerns, a lot of the Weird Menace stuff, a lot of stuff they left unpublished. But fortunately, the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press is taking that up. And they are busy publishing all the stuff that you can't find in the Del Rey editions. So it's a great time to be a Robert E. Howard fan, that's for sure, with all of this stuff available to us. But it answers the question why these didn't sell as well, because if you have all those other volumes, you have more than half of what's in these two volumes. So, there are a lot of Conan stories in here, Solomon Kane, Cull, because some of those stories are the best stories. And so you already have those. And so you have to decide, if you're a Robert E. Howard fan, do I need a best of volume when I have all of these stories or most of these stories in other places? That's especially true now when the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press is publishing all those other books. I think even if you're a Robert E. Howard fan, there's a place for these, I've discovered, because like I said, I've gone back to these volumes over and over again. But let's take a look at them, and let's look at the contents that were chosen for these volumes and talk about whether they're actually the best. Are they actually the best of Robert E. Howard? So let's get into it. The very first story in the best of Robert E. Howard, the 2-volume set, is The Shadow Kingdom, which is the first King Cull story, and it is one of the best Robert E. Howard stories ever written. So yes, this belongs in this volume, and it belongs where it's placed. The very first story in the best of volume. And I think it belongs here because this story, The Shadow Kingdom, if you don't like this story, you're probably not going to like Robert E. Howard, probably. If this story doesn't make you a Robert E. Howard fan, I don't know what will. It's beautifully written, full of action, and it's often considered the first sword and sorcery story of all time. So not only is it full of action, it's also full of horror. It's a great weird story. It's a great fantasy story. It has everything you want from Robert E. Howard, I think, The Shadow Kingdom. It's brilliant. So definitely belongs as the first story in this volume. And it is, like I said, a King Cole story. Now, between all of these stories, we have examples of Robert E. Howard's poetry, which is great. So it's not only a best of his fiction, it's a best of his poetry. That's wonderful as well. This is The Ghost Kings. Curse of the Golden Skull. Is that one of Robert E. Howard's best stories? Well, it's pretty good. I don't know if it's one of his best, but it's pretty good. It's a kind of King Cole story. He is in it a bit. And it's the second story in the volume, a short little story. But that's followed by the Solomon Kane story, Red Shadows, which definitely belongs in here. Red Shadows is an excellent story. One of the best Solomon Kane stories, probably. And it's in here as the third story in the volume. So we get Red Shadows. And again, the illustrations in this, I think, are excellent. And I really like that one there. So that's followed by Red Shadows. Then we have another poem, One Black Stain. And that's followed by The Dark Man. The Dark Man, which is sort of in the Bran Mak Morn series, the Pictish King. A great story. Again, excellent choice. The Dark Man probably does belong in a best of volume. Again, great illustration. So far we're doing very well. Then we've got kind of a team up of Bran Mak Morn and King Cole. This is Kings of the Night. And I'm glad they included this story because this, I think, is one of Robert E. Howard's best stories. It's a story that really shows that all of his characters do all exist in one universe, because here we have two characters separated by a vast gulf of time, joining forces through magic to fight the Romans in ancient Britain. So it's great. It has some of Robert E. Howard's best writing of combat and war. And so it's excellent about this battle between the Picts and the Romans. And it also has, if I could find it, there's King Cole fighting the Romans. That's awesome. This is the picture I was looking for. That's Bran Mak Morn. And this, for me personally, I think this is my favorite illustration of Bran Mak Morn. I think that's just perfect. It's just a perfect representation of this character. Done in this really interesting style that the Keegans used for these volumes. So we're doing really well in our best of volume. These are definitely some of the best Robert E. Howard stories. Then we get The Black Stone, which is a horror story. I don't think this is his best horror story, but it's up there. The Black Stone is fantastic. It's been frequently anthologized, The Black Stone. It's a particularly horrifying story with some pretty frightening moments. So The Black Stone, okay, we're doing really well. These are indeed some of his best stories. So then we get The Fightinist Pair, which is a boxing story. So this is interesting. So here we are with a boxing story. Robert E. Howard wrote a lot of boxing stories. And they have not been reprinted nearly as often as his other stories have. And there is not a volume of boxing stories in the Del Rey edition of Robert E. Howard, which is understandable because they're not fantasy stories, they're adventure stories featuring a lot of boxing. You know, at the time in the pulps in the 1930s, sports in the 20s and 30s, sports stories were really popular. So you had whole pulps devoted to stories, fiction, about baseball and football and boxing. And Robert E. Howard was really interested in boxing. And this is a particularly good boxing story. And so this is cool because this is a story that you might not find in other places. And there's Mike the Bulldog there, well-named Bulldog. Then we have The Gray God Passes, which is a great fantasy story. Here we are with another wonderful story, The Gray God Passes. Excellent. So yeah, this is definitely one of the best. And that is followed by a story that I think might be Robert E. Howard's greatest story, and that is Worms of the Earth, another Bran McMorn story. A horror story, a fantasy story, definitely one of the best stories that ever appeared in Weird Tales. Is it Robert E. Howard's best story? I don't know. But it is just great. It is just great. And yeah, deserves to be in this volume. In fact, I don't think you could have a best of volume that was really a best of volume if it didn't have that story. Got more poetry. And then we have Lord of the Dead. Look at that. This is a Steve Harrison story. And that is a perfect Steve Harrison illustration, which perfectly captures this character. Lord of the Dead, however, I don't think it's the best Steve Harrison story. So it's interesting that it's in here. It's very pulpy. And when I say that, I mean it has examples of things that you would find in a lot of pulp adventure stories. All done wonderfully well by Robert E. Howard. There's our evil villain there. And it's an excellent pulp story. Look at that. That's fantastic. That's just great. But like I said, I don't think it's the best Harrison story, and I'm not sure it's really one of the best. Then we got For the Love of Barbara Allen, which is an excellent story. Is it one of his best? Probably not. And yet it's in here, and it's, like I said, you've got 900 pages. So yeah, you could put those in here. Valley of the Worm is definitely one of Robert E. Howard's best stories, and a story that at the time that this was published was not available in other places in anything in print at the time. They are now. This is a James Allison story, and all the James Allison stories have recently been reprinted. Was it Swords of the North from the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press? Excellent volume. And so this is a story you can get along with the other Allison stories nowadays. Great, great story. Definitely deserves to be in this volume, Valley of the Worm. Spectacular illustration there. That's just great. And so then we're getting to Conan stories. So he had to decide which Conan stories out of all the Conan stories to pick. And he picked The People of the Black Circle, which I cannot argue with because that is an excellent, excellent story. Great illustration there. People of the Black Story is pretty great. So yeah, I can't argue that. The inclusion of that story. That is followed by another one of Robert E. Howard's best stories of all time, Beyond the Black River. Definitely one of the best Conan stories. Definitely one of Robert E. Howard's best stories. That one certainly belongs in a best of volume. So there we go. We got that. Beyond the Black River. Excellent stuff. That is followed by an Elborak story, Hawk of the Hills. So again, we have another illustration which is perfect. That is a perfect Francis Xavier Gordon illustration that perfectly captures the spirit of this character. And as soon as I saw this illustration, ever since I saw this, that is how I picture him in my mind. It's just perfect. And Hawk of the Hills is really good. It's a really good story. So what you see happening in this volume is that Rusty Burke is choosing not only the best stories that he thinks are the best, but he's also choosing stories that show the range of Robert E. Howard's writing. So you're not just getting fantasies, you're getting adventure, you're getting westerns, you're getting horror. Here is a Breckinridge Elkins story, which shows an example of his humorous westerns, which were some of the most popular things that Robert E. Howard wrote during his lifetime. Breckinridge Elkins is not a character that you hear much about from Robert E. Howard, but it was one of his most popular series of stories. So that's in here. And it closes out this first volume with lines written in the realization that I must die. Great poem. And there's a short biography of Robert E. Howard at the end of this. So this is spectacular as a best of volume. But it wasn't enough. So they came out with a volume 2. A volume 2. And this basically follows the same format as the first one, in that you have to have a Cull story, you have to have Solomon Kane, you have to have Conan. So this is just like the first volume in that. It has more wonderful illustrations from the Keegans. And another fat volume, you have another introduction, and it starts off with another Cull story, this time By This Axe I Rule, which is one of the best King Cull stories. There were not many King Cull stories. And the thing about this, and including this in the best of volume, is that this is not the best version of the story. This was turned into a Conan story. By This Axe I Rule was rejected by Weird Tales and was never published during Robert E. Howard's lifetime. So he took the story, he changed a bunch of things, and he turned it into the very first Conan story, which was The Phoenix on the Sword. And The Phoenix on the Sword is far superior, in my opinion, to By This Axe I Rule. Like I said, this is an excellent story, but he made it better when he turned it into a Conan story. So that is actually a better version of this. But since it's 2 volumes, he had to put another King Cull story in there, and so he did, with By This Axe I Rule. Then we have The King and the Oak, which is a King Cull poem, which is really, really good. Does deserve to be in here. Then we have The Mirrors of Tuzan Thune, which many people consider to be one of Robert E. Howard's best. This has never been a favorite of mine, this story. Another King Cull story, kind of a weird one. This one was published during Robert E. Howard's lifetime in Weird Tales. So I can't argue the inclusion of that. And then we have another Conan story. This is The Tower of the Elephant, which is one of Robert E. Howard's very best stories. And it's one of the stories that if you read it and you've never read Robert E. Howard before, you will want to read more Robert E. Howard and more Conan, because it's wonderful. It's a fantastic story. It's one of the best stories that was ever published in Weird Tales. Definitely one of the best Conan stories. So yeah, this is definitely one of the best. Just a perfect example of a sword and sorcery story. One of the best sword and sorcery stories ever written. We have Wings in the Night, which is a Solomon Kane story. And this is probably the best Solomon Kane story. I think it's the most important Solomon Kane story. I talked about this years ago in a video all its own. And I went into why I think it's so important. And I will talk about it again in the near future, a couple videos from now. Because this is wonderful. And yeah, it belongs in this volume. Wings in the Night. Then we have The Lord of Samarkand, which is an historical story, which I'm kind of surprised is in here. It's good. It's a good story. Is it one of Robert E. Howard's best, though? I don't know. I don't know if it is. Great illustration there. It is a really good story, so I guess I can't argue. If you've got 900 pages, you might as well put it in there. Then you have more poetry, The Song of the Naked Land. Then we have The Shadow of the Vulture. Definitely deserves to be in here. Definitely one of the Robert E. Howard's best stories. This is the story where Red Sonja appears, which Roy Thomas in the Marvel comic book took and turned into Red Sonja and made a whole other character out of this character that appeared in this one Robert E. Howard story. It's a great story, though. Another historical story, The Shadow of the Vulture, and probably there's Red Sonja there. Probably, I don't know if it's his best historical story, but it could be. It's just fantastic. It's fantastic. This is a story Roy Thomas turned into a Conan story. Then we've got another boxing story, The Bulldog Breed. So we've got a second volume. We have to put another boxing story in there. So they chose this one. And it's excellent. I can't argue it. It's a good boxing story. Then we have Black Harps, another poem, Black Harps in the Hills. Then we've got The Man on the Ground, which is kind of a supernatural Western. Is it one of his best? I don't think so, but it's good. It's good, but is it one of his best? I don't know. Rusty Burke thought so. Old Garfield's Heart. Can't speak. Old Garfield's Heart definitely is one of his best. It's a really good horror story, and here it is in this volume. It's really good, so that's understandable that that's in there. Then we have another Western. This is a straight non-humorous Western, Vultures of Waketon. Could be one of his best Western stories. So yeah, definitely belongs in this volume. It's excellent. Has two endings, and you always have to include both endings when you put Vultures of Waketon in there. Another excellent story. Great illustrations from the Keegans. Then we have another Western story. This is a Pike Bearfield, right? Which is another one of his humorous Westerns. So that's in there. Gents on the Lynch. Then we have The Grimland, which is the story that gives this volume its name. Excellent poem. Then we have Pigeons from Hell. Pigeons from Hell, which is an hilarious title for a great horror story, zombie story, which is excellent. Great sense of time and place in this story. Really creepy. And it's just excellent. So yeah, it is one of his best and definitely belongs in this volume. More great illustrations. Then we have Wild Water. This is a good story. Is it one of his best? I don't know. I don't know that it is, but it's in here. So I guess it was considered one of his best. But for me personally, excellent illustration. Me personally, I don't know if it was. Then we have another El Borak story, because we're in volume 2. We have to have another one. And so we have Son of the White Wolf, and it's an excellent story. Will not argue the inclusion of that, because that is fantastic. And then we have a pirate story, which is interesting. This is Black Volmea's Vengeance. Now, this actually started off as an unsold Conan story, The Black Stranger, which Robert E. Howard was unable to sell, so he rewrote it as a pirate story, with the main character being Black Volmea, without an element of the supernatural. This is just a straight pirate story. And it's a really good one. It's a really good one. Pirate stories are fun, so, I'm not surprised to see that in here. And then we have Conan in Red Nails. So the Conan stories were split up in this volume. And this volume closes out. I believe it closes out with Red Nails. Let me make sure I'm not wrong. Yeah, it does. It closes out with Red Nails, which is a good Conan story. I don't think it's one of his best. As good as it is in a lot of ways, I don't think it's one of the best Conan stories. And even an authority like Carl Edward Wagner, great fantasy horror writer Carl Edward Wagner, who was also an excellent editor. He came out with a wonderful edition of Conan back in the 70s. He didn't particularly like Red Nails. I remember that. But there are some excellent points to this story. has great atmosphere, great claustrophobic atmosphere, full of horrific violence. But it's also full of obvious pulpisms that don't need to be in here. Like there's a lot of there's a lot of women whipping other women, you know, just because it's titillating. It was that kind of thing was titillating to the pulp reader at the time. Hey, I'm not judging. Who am I to judge? You know, but it seemed a little silly, I have to say. And so, Red Nails, does it really belong in a volume of the best of Robert E. Howard? I could think of other Conan stories that I would put in here before that one. So, the verdict, is this the best of Robert E. Howard? Mostly, I think it is. But like I said, this 2-volume set has a fatal flaw, and that is it's 2 volumes when it really doesn't need to be. So why would you even have an edition of the best of Robert E. Howard when you've already got most of these stories published in other places? One of the reasons that you would have one, aside from the fact that it is cool to revisit the very best of Robert E. Howard, if you just want to read Robert E. Howard and you don't want to read everything, it's cool to pick up the best, which is something, like I said, that I've done. I've reread these volumes a lot over the years, which would have surprised me, I think, when I first picked these up. I was wondering, you know, am I really going to come back to these when I've got all these stories in other places? I have. I've gone back to these a lot. But also, if you have a volume of the best, that's the kind of thing you can give to other people. Like, you've never read Robert E. Howard? Read this, you know. This will give you a taste of his best stuff. And what these volumes do is they give you a sense of all the different kinds of things that Robert E. Howard wrote. And in his short lifetime, he wrote a lot. He wrote a lot. So that's an advantage of these. But that advantage is kind of killed when you put, because now you have to give 2 volumes. Here, take both of these. You know, read these 900 pages of Robert E. Howard, and that'll give you a sense of that's a lot to ask. That's a big ask. So I understand it was hard to choose the best out of all the stories which you think are the best of Robert E. Howard. But by making these 2 volumes, I just think you kind of shot yourself in the foot, you know, or they shot themselves in the foot when they did it. This should have been 1 volume. It should have been 1 big volume. It could have been a 600-page volume that included the best. And I think there is room for that. In fact, I think what I would like to see is a new version of this, a new best of Robert E. Howard volume. And in my next exciting episode of the Robert E. Howard Show, I'm going to give you what I think should be the best of Robert E. Howard. This definitely has some of the very best stories, as you've seen as I was going through the contents. This has some selections in here that cannot be argued. Worms of the Earth, you can't argue that. This is a great selection of stories. But you need to whittle it down, I think, even further. I think about a 600-page volume would be about right. That's big, but I think that would be about right. And that is something that you can give to people and say, hey, check this out. See if you like this writer. And so next week, I'm going to give you the selections I think should be in a best of volume. And I'm kind of hopeful that somebody does it, or somebody does a new best of volume. Maybe the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press can do one when they're done publishing everything else, because Robert E. Howard wrote a lot, and the Robert E. Howard Foundation Press is pretty busy putting out all of that stuff. But you never know. Maybe one day we'll get one from somebody. I hope we do. But next week you get to hear my selections for a best of volume. And I'll shut up now because, man, I've gone on for a long time. I will catch you next time.